it was never a thought. I mean, as far as like that I wouldn't make it in whatever I do. I I always say New York is a great place to be from because it taught me so much of my core values, ethics, and my ability to overcome a lot of obstacles. I think that people, especially out here in California, it's like they call it the bubble, where we live here. It's like people here think that everybody in the world lives like they do. I got news for you. They don't. This bubble is different. So when I came to the bubble of South Bay, Redondo Beach, Hermosa Beach, Manhattan Beach, Palos Verdes, right here. Um, I just looked around, even the 405, the main, our highway here, and there's so many people. And I'm like, I just would look around. I'm like, man, if I could get $1 from every car that had passed me, just $1, everybody's got $1, I could make it. And so that was kind of the initial mentality. I remember that vividly. And then like looking around again, back to where I said earlier, when I had people telling me, oh, you could move inland, 5-10 miles and it's, half the price. But I would look where I'm at and there's houses and people everywhere. I'm like, man, if all these people have made it and figured out how to stay here and live here, I sure as hell can too. So I always had that mentality. The nutrition, I mean, the fitness part of it, in the beginning, like I said, when I graduated with a health and wellness degree, I had no clue what I would do. But I stuck to doing, what I knew. And they say if you're doing something that you love, you don't work a day in your life. And I fully believe that because, and I couldn't even, in the beginning, I couldn't even imagine, as you alluded to earlier, it's expensive for a trainer. And it's, it's the, I figured like, who would pay this kind of money? So I had a hard time actually charging people for my worth. And that's more of what it is. What's it worth? Like, is it expensive or is it an investment? I call it an investment. Like if you're investing in your health and the longevity of your health and the stuff, the tips and the knowledge that I can give to somebody, if they take that, it's a huge investment for them to gather that knowledge. Back to, the Reiki and, just all these different aspects of what makes me me. And that's how I started separating myself as a trainer, because there's thousands and thousands and thousands of trainers or health coaches or fitness instructors or types of workouts or types of fitness. How do I make me, Dom, different than everyone else? I started, getting knowledge and expertise in different areas to form me. Then I started getting into, as you alluded to earlier, network marketing and different types of home-based business. And I'm like, you know what? Yeah, one income or one style, one way to make money for myself is not going to be enough for what I want to do for the rest of my life, to be able to travel the world, to be able to have homes wherever I want, to be able to, raise a family and to be a provider and to do all of that. I'm going to need more. So I started just staying, I shouldn't say started, I always stayed open. And I believe that's one of my superpowers is always have had an open mind and never, you know, said, no, I'm like, okay, what do you got? Show me what it is. And then by doing that, man, it just expanded my mind and blew, even we'll go back to Reiki. Um, it was, see, my son is 14. My wife was pregnant with him. So 15 years ago, I tore a quad muscle and it was not going away. I did every traditional recovery thing I could do, physical therapist, rest, ice, stay off of it, make it work, work it lightly. Nothing was working. And I had a client who, she was a Reiki master, and I had no clue what that meant or what it was. I was open. So I asked her, could you, I was like, do you still do that? Is it Reiki? She laughed. She's like, yeah. I'm like, do you still do that? She's like, oh yeah. She's like, what's going on? I told her about my quad. She's like, all right, just grab a mat, lay it here on the floor in the gym, and you know, just relax. So I did. She literally just laid her hands on my leg like this, did not move them, did nothing. And I'm laying there thinking like, all right,
Yeah, what is this voodoo magic?
what is this voodoo? And then about 2 minutes later, I'm like, it's getting really warm, in my head. About a minute or two more, I'm like, okay, that heat sensation, if we scale it 1 to 10, we'll say it's at a 3 or 4. Another minute goes by, it's about a 5 or 6. Another minute goes by, it's about a 6 or 7. And she's doing nothing. I mean, literally nothing, but has her hands laid on my leg. And at that point, she turns to me and she goes, you might feel it getting it warm or tingly or whatever. And I'm like, oh yeah. She's like, isn't that wild? Yeah. And I'm like, why is it so wild? I mean, in my head again, I'm like, what the heck's so wild about? What is going on? Literally within the next 3-4 minutes, it went from like a 7 to an 8 to a 9 of heat. And like, just, I almost had to ask her to take her hands off my leg. It was getting so hot. And then I had that internal conversation, like, no, suck it up. Like she doesn't have fire under her hands. There's nothing. I don't know what it is. Anyway, she did it for maybe 10 minutes. She's like, okay, see how that feels. I get up, I stand up, I pull my leg to my butt. I'm like, I could not even touch my foot before that. I literally grabbed my leg, pulled it up, did like a quad stretch. Had to do the other side just to make sure it was the right side. Did a couple of full squats, looked at her. I'm like, what the heck just happened? That night or the next night, I went and played softball and really tore it again, re-injured it again. So my first lesson of healing versus healed, I was healing. So the next week she came in, I asked her, if she could do it again. She's like, oh, is it still bothering you? And I'm like, yeah. I was like, I didn't tell her what I did. She literally put her hands on my leg again. Within seconds, she goes, wow, it feels much deeper this time. She's like, did you re-injure it? I'm like,
you get like embarrassed to tell her.
Well, but I'm like, how the fuck did she know? And I was embarrassed to say, yeah. And she just laughed. And I did the same test as I did before. It was like, I tried to pull my leg up to my butt. I couldn't even come close to touching my foot. She does the same thing happens. I stand up, I'll grab my foot, I pull it to my butt, same thing, squat down. And she's like, I'd really love to, it's called an attunement, basically pass along the gift. Doing a Reiki attunement for you and for Liz, because she's pregnant right now. She's going to be in some discomfort, and you can give her Reiki and practice on her. And you're always going to need it from
this would be your wife, right?
My wife. Yeah. So, I'm like, yeah, that'd be great. So I come home, I tell my wife, and she's like, well, let's look it up. So we look up what is Reiki. And the very first 2 sites we go to, it's transfer of energy through the universe, through the administrator's hands. They're like, it's not a religion, it's not a cult, it just is. Okay, cool.
One more site. That checked off the first box. Okay, it's not a cult.
It's not a cult, it's not a religion, it just is. And I'm like, I'm down. So we went and got attuned, passed the gift, and then we became what was called Reiki 1. Reiki 1 is your minister, and you can now start giving Reiki. I mean, there's a few things within it you need to do, but nothing crazy. And I remember when we left her house, she's like, she's like, your kids they'll love that. Kids love it, and animals love it if they need it. If they don't, they kind of freak out. And I'm like, okay. The next day, my dog we had a puppy at the time, and he had a bad knee from birth. And our friend's dog, they were running and chasing. It went to jump up, it slipped, fell down, and it was howling like he got ran over by a car. I'm like, I scooped him up, I brought him upstairs, shut the door, I started giving him Reiki. And I shit you not, within 2 minutes, he was passed out snoring. I'm like, what the heck is going on?
You got that magic touch now.
Woo. So then I go train my client a couple of days later, who's probably one of the most spiritual and Catholic. Actually, this necklace I have on is my saint, my hero, which is one of the very first pieces that she ever did. That's a whole nother crazy story. So she has an issue with her Achilles and like calf area. And I asked her, can I do Reiki on you? And she's like, and I didn't know how she was going to take it, being hardcore Catholic, because whatever. She's like, oh, I love Reiki. This one master that travels. I'm like, cool. She lays down. I'm giving it to her. And I can feel like tingly and like crazy heat, almost like I did on my leg, happening in my hands. I'm like, wow. She gets up in about 10 minutes. I'm like, I don't know if you felt anything, whatever. She got up. It was immediately feeling better. She's like, oh, yeah. She goes, it was shooting up my leg, across my butt, down my other leg, and out my big toe the other side. And I'm like literally just going, what is going on? So that's a long story of saying at that point, I was already open. That just kept my mind open to like, I know nothing. And as you've learned, the more we learn, the less we realize we don't know anything. And as long as not that we don't know anything, there's so much more to learn. And I've always stayed with that mentality and that mindset. And it just keeps bringing me more and more and more people into my life to shift and change and to mold and to expand. Then Mr. Nelson comes into my life and just really blew it up to a whole nother level of like just endless possibilities of what's really out there. Stay open, keep that mind completely wide open, that that there is way more than you could ever imagine or expect.